Hello, welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on the Privatization of Education with David Halperin, Robert Shireman, and Constance Iloh, and moderated by Ian Masters. Sorry, that's Constance Iloh. So on to tonight's program. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of Andy and Branya Galef. Tonight's Hammer Forum is about the growing indebtedness of students in this country and about the for-profit educational institutions that may or may not be disproportionately exploiting the poor. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ian Masters, who's going to introduce our three guests. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of the Daily Briefing, Mondays through Thursdays at 5, as well as Background Briefing on Sundays at 11, all on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and all of you for coming tonight to look into a subject that for decades now has been every politician's catchphrase: we've got to do something about education. Except, of course, for those politicians who want to abolish the Department of Education but can't remember which one of the government programs is that they want to get rid of. How many times have we heard them say that we've got to improve our education? We've got to become more competitive in a global economy. Now it seems billionaires and philanthropists too are joining in the chorus, decrying test scores and lamenting how our kids are slipping behind in math and science as we sink near the bottom of developed countries on the global scale of international dunces. But perhaps we are asking too much of ourselves, since between a quarter and a third of our population believe the dinosaurs shared cabin space on Noah's Ark with zebras and lions, who apparently enjoyed the dining arrangements aboard so much so that they did not feast on each other during the long cruise. Clearly, learning about the origins of the species is still in doubt, because with equal billing on the playing field of education, Bill Nye, the science guy, just debated Ken Ham, the founder of the creation movement, a museum. Is this what politicians mean when they say we need to get back to basics? In a fair and balanced way, of course, where faith equals fact, knowledge equals belief, and genius equals genesis. Do we now have a new equivalence to moral relativism, intellectual relativism, or is knowledge an optional accessory as we go reality shopping, just more consumer choice in the supermarket of belief? So if we are the dumb superpower, could politicians be the missing link? And if we get the politicians we deserve, do we therefore get the education we deserve? Certainly, when you look into who is enabling the proliferation of taxpayer-funded for-profit colleges and why student debt has grown to the point where it equals household debt, you can hardly avoid pointing the finger at our politicians, who on a bipartisan basis since they are beholden to the same lobbyists, seem to have turned over the nation's educational resources to bottom-feeding diploma mills and a vast debt collection operation which makes the mafia look like philanthropists. The Student Loan Ombudsman and Assistant Director at the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has recently warned that student debt services and companies that handle student loan payments are cheating borrowers by not allowing them to reduce their debt burdens by paying down their most expensive loans first. According to the Education Department and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau data, we have some 40 million borrowers carrying $1.2 trillion in unpaid student loans, with $29,400 in student debt on average for borrowers who graduated with bachelor degrees in 2012. And according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, borrowers are more likely to be delinquent on their student loans than any other consumer debt. Many economists are worried student loan payments are reducing America's ability to spend, save, and invest, and are depressing economic growth. Because as student debt burdens have risen, younger borrowers with student debt become less likely to purchase a home, refrigerators, or a car. As we explore the widening gulf between the diminishing prospects of our indentured generation of students and the well-funded careers of our political leaders, whose success appears to come at the expense of the hopes and dreams of our kids entering a downsized job market, one statistic stands out. Just one family who happened to be champions of charter schools, the Waltons, the heirs to the Walmart fortune, have the combined wealth equivalent to the lower 40% of all American households. So tonight we'll try to get some clarity on the perils and promises of our perennially troubled educational sector, and hopefully find the truth somewhere between the bashing of unions and the worshipping of billionaires, between the egos of entrepreneurs and the obstinacy of bureaucrats. Finally, as the middle class shrinks and working Americans struggle for a living wage, if education and economic reform is not forthcoming, and if growing income and wealth inequality leads to a societal breakdown and civil strife, a little knowledge could turn out to be a dangerous thing. Our speakers will give 10-minute presentations, then we will have a conversation before extensive Q&A with you, our learned audience. Robert Shireman has worked to rein in abuses of for-profit colleges and student loan companies. He currently directs California Competes, a nonprofit project aimed at addressing the state's higher education challenges. Previously, Bob Shireman spearheaded the Obama administration's successful efforts to reform student lending, increase Pell Grants, simplify the financial aid process, strengthen consumer protections, and focus national attention on college completion. In 2004, Shireman launched the Institute for College Access and Success, where his early leadership on the issues of rising student debt prompted Congress to adopt income-based repayment for student loans. Inside and outside of the government, Bob Shireman has worked to improve campus diversity, reform high schools, recruit new teachers, and renovate crumbling schools. His efforts on student loans and college access earned him Money Magazine's Money Hero status in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Shireman.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to everyone here for braving the very welcome rain that we are having. I like to start out with the assumption that people's intentions are good. So when I was on the Obama administration's transition team after the 2008 election, for-profit college executives came in and made a compelling case. For-profit colleges are not constrained by all of the bureaucracy of a public university, the lockstep semester schedules, the big buildings on sprawling campuses. We were in the midst of a terrible recession that we are still emerging from. These colleges were able to respond by creating campuses in office parks, creating online opportunities. They're able to respond quickly to a demand. They see the need, can snap their fingers, hire some faculty, start some classes. I remember them saying, we look for the fastest way to a skilled job for the students that we enroll. Moreover, they made the case that their profit motive gives them the financial incentive to serve students well, to be efficient and affordable, and to build a good reputation for the college for the long term. Good intentions, I assumed. Unfortunately, the data don't paint such a pretty picture of for-profit education. For-profit colleges enroll 13% of the students in the country, but have 46% of the defaulted student loans. Senate investigators reviewed 1.1 million enrollment records and found that 54% of the students had dropped out in a median of just 4 months. Of those who graduate, 57% of these large for-profit colleges students had high student loan debts, which is double the rate at nonprofit colleges and quadruple the proportion at public colleges. Kamala Harris, who is our state attorney general here in California, recently filed suit against one major for-profit chain accusing them of predatory practices, taking advantage of single mothers and other vulnerable people who just want the American dream. She said the colleges were doing things like pretending to have programs they don't have in order to get prospects in the door. Try Googling community college. The things that come up are not community colleges. Cooking the books on job placement rates, using emotional manipulation, targeting people, and these are from their recruitment guides for their salespeople, who they call recruiters, advisors, but they are salespeople. They tell them to look for people who are isolated, who have low self-esteem, who have few people in their lives who care about them, and essentially become their friend and tell them this is the right program for you. Similar evidence at other for-profit colleges and universities have fortunately led a number of attorneys general across the country to begin investigations and file suits. So we're seeing some progress. But really, what's going on here? What explains the difference between these good intentions and why are they not resulting in those good outcomes that I heard about during the Obama transition? Well, I brought 15 $1,000 bills, just so you're not distracted. There's actually no such thing as a $1,000 bill. But let's follow the money to give you a sense of what actually happens at a for-profit college. So $15,000 representing the revenue into a for-profit from a sample student. In terms of where the money comes from, 13,000 of the 15,000 comes from the U.S. government in the form of grants and loans. Of the other 2,000, a lot of it actually comes from private loans with interest rates that the school itself helped arrange, with interest rates up to 18% and default rates on those loans of 50% or higher in some cases. So most of the money is coming from the U.S. government. Now, on the spending side, the most important thing, of course, for a college or a school to spend money on is on instruction, on the interaction between students and faculty members that is the core of higher education. For-profit colleges, on average, out of this $15,000, are spending about $3,000 on instruction. More than that amount that is spent on instruction is provided to investors in the form of profit. And then yet more is used for recruiting and advertising. And really, recruiting and advertising you should think of as profit, because the way you become rich as an investor in a for-profit college is through growth. You want your college to double, triple, quadruple, quintuple in size, because you then have all of that revenue coming in based on the same amount of investment. So the investment that these colleges make in recruiting new students and advertising is a way to grow the college that is essentially more profit that they put into their pockets through the escalation of the stock price that comes from the growth of the college. Out of the remaining funds, there is some that is spent on things like student support. But for every student support staff member, there are 3 recruiters. Some money is spent on things like career services, but for every career services staff member, there are 10 recruiters out trying to grow the size of the college. There's also a portion of this that goes into executive compensation, so more goes into the pocket. Executive compensation on average at the big publicly traded for-profit colleges averages about $7 million for a CEO of colleges you probably have never heard of. Why does this happen? Well, as the president of one for-profit college said, one of the large ones, good intentions can be scuttled because the colleges are capable of bringing investors a dramatic return, as he said, by shortchanging students. There's unrelenting pressure to bring in large profits, and that pressure is inherent in the model, in a for-profit model. While a CEO can try to manage for the long term and be that college that is building a good reputation over time and investing back in the education of the students, the dominant incentive, which is enforced by the threat of hostile takeovers in a publicly traded company, is to follow this playbook. One, spend as little as possible on the actual education. Second, pocket as much of the rest as possible, either as profit or as growth. Third, enroll vulnerable populations who can't blow the whistle because it will be partly their fault that they failed. And fourth, if anyone questions what you're doing, accuse them of being elitist and undermining access for the low-income people who you are enrolling. Fortunately, President Obama managed to see what's been going on here. And last August, he said, students get out of these for-profit colleges loaded down with enormous debt. They can't find a job, they default, the taxpayer ends up holding the bag, their credit is ruined, and the for-profit institution is making out like a bandit. That's a problem. Now, what about those good intentions, though? You would think that the honest leaders at these colleges, the ones who recognize that the good side of the profit motive that drives in some of the right directions also has a bad side, and that it's in their interests for there to be good regulations that help to prevent the race to the bottom that we've seen, to help to steer the industry in the right directions. You would think they would support that if they had good intentions. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., the industry, the big players in the industry who really matter, have fought vigorously against reforms, modest reforms proposed by the Obama administration and some folks in Congress. When I was at the Obama administration, we proposed some basic standards. If taxpayer dollars are going into a career program that is supposed to be preparing people for gainful employment, let's have some base level standard where if the program is not delivering, you can't get federal money anymore. And the standard was if more than half of the students have crippling debt, let's not fund that program anymore. And you can even we even gave an out if more than a third of the students were actually making payments on their student loans. This was a pathetically low standard, but it was a standard. The industry sued, it got thrown out on a technicality, and now the Obama administration is coming back for another round, and we're hopeful that we will get a good rule out of it. But it is a big fight at every step. And I think there's a good chance that we can get some effective consumer safeguards, but it really depends on public support battling the interest groups in Washington that seemed to have good intentions, but are absolutely not pushing things in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. David Halperin is a senior fellow at Republic Report. He was previously founding director of Campus Progress and senior vice president at the Center for American Progress, senior policy advisor for Howard Dean's presidential campaign, founding executive director of the American Constitution Society, White House speechwriter and special assistant for national security affairs to President Clinton, and counsel to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, David Halperin.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I come from the East. For the Southern California crowd, I hope that I can do something sort of theatrical, which is, if Bob was able to maybe shock you a little bit, I'm hoping to appall you with the story that I tell you. Honestly, I could spend my time doing what Bob did and talk about the shocking abuses of these for-profit colleges. I speak every week with students whose lives, their financial futures have been destroyed by this industry. But really, I want to tell you a different story, and Bob alluded to it. This is a story about what happened after this misconduct became well known. The big industry players did not apologize and say, okay, we'll reform. Instead, they've spent millions to claim they've done nothing wrong, that they're the victims of rabid ideologues and sinister Wall Street short sellers. In 2009, as Bob described, when the Obama administration began efforts to hold these bad schools accountable through a rule called gainful employment, the for-profit colleges attacked with all their might. Now, where did they get the money to attack with all their might? They got it from you and me and all of us. Big for-profit colleges get 86% of their revenue from federal aid. The industry gets $33 billion a year from taxpayers. 33 billion, not million. They've used that money to hire an army of lobbyists, lawyers, and consultants. This is a story about how Washington created a monster so big that it can work its will on the political system even after it has been thoroughly discredited in public. Among the lobbyists for this industry, you might imagine, are Republicans like former Senate leader Trent Lott. But the industry focused its hiring of lobbyists on Democrats to lobby a Democratic administration. They hired Richard Gephardt, you might remember him, ran for president, lobbyist for for-profit colleges. Lanny Davis, a pugnacious lawyer you might see on cable TV, saying he's a liberal Democrat, lobbyist for for-profit colleges. Governor Ed Rendell, you might see him on TV, Democratic governor from Pennsylvania. He joined an industry-created panel to create a code of conduct for for-profit colleges. Now, this proved to be just a public relations stunt when the panel just disappeared one day without any explanation. The for-profit colleges hired Anita Dunn. She was President Obama's campaign and White House communications director. She worked to undermine President Obama's initiative to hold for-profit colleges accountable, and she did it for money. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois concluded that for-profit colleges own every lobbyist in town. The for-profit colleges filled the airwaves. They already had 1 million ads telling you why you should go to a for-profit college. Now they started to run ads explaining why President Obama's initiative would destroy student options, destroy student choice. They engaged in dirty tricks, sending letters from non-existent people attacking advocates for reform. Some of the advocates for reform are on the stage right now. Another trick was to publish an article by a prominent person arguing against reforms and never telling you that the person who wrote the article actually had a financial interest in this industry. Those included the former governor of New Jersey, Tom Kean, former Senator Bob Kerrey. The University of Phoenix hired Susie Orman, who calls herself America's most recognized expert on personal finance, to promote the school, even though attending an expensive for-profit college like the University of Phoenix is one of the worst financial decisions that you can make for most people. For their lavish conventions, the for-profits hired big names. Their trade association, APSCU, ran these conventions. They brought in big names. In 2011, it was Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, it turns out that he's part of a private equity firm that invests in for-profit colleges, including the second biggest one, which is called EDMC. He has embraced an industry that abuses service members and veterans. By the way, the entertainment at that convention was the Beach Boys, or at least the Mike Love version of the Beach Boys. They might have sang fun, fun, fun till taxpayers take the money away. For the 2012 convention, the keynote speaker was George W. Bush. The other was Michelle Rhee, the education reformer. Now, I criticized Rhee for speaking at a convention of schools that refused to be held accountable. And she pledged to give a tough message to these schools. They wouldn't let us in the room to find out what she said, but we got a tape recorder in the room, and she soft-pedaled and told these schools that they were doing marvelous work. In 2013, Admiral Mike Mullen, who had just left being chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was invited to be the keynote speaker. I questioned his decision publicly. He ended up not appearing, but APSCU was easily able to hire a replacement. They hired General Wesley Clark to speak at their convention. We have a very strong coalition of student groups, civil rights groups, veterans groups, consumer groups, trying to get some reasonable reforms here, but we get outgunned. If we ask for a sit-down with congressional staff to talk about these issues, we can see at the next table that for-profit colleges are actually sitting with members of Congress lobbying on this. At a charity auction, a man named Avi Stein, who owns for-profit colleges, was able to buy a lunch with Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa, who is the chief Democrat in the Senate on education issues. They started arguing in the hallway, and Harkin says that Stein took the opportunity to threaten Harkin and say he would make life rough for Harkin if Harkin kept up his attacks on the for-profit colleges. For-profit colleges also use donations to gain the support of nonprofit groups that should be on the side of students. Mark Morial is the head of the National Urban League. He publicly opposed President Obama's regulations to hold these schools accountable. Later, the Urban League took $1 million from Corinthian colleges, one of the worst for-profit schools, and Morial took a paid position on the Corinthian board of directors. There's a watchdog group in Washington called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. They joined with some Republicans and also with the head of the University of Phoenix, John Sperling, who's a big Democratic donor, in calling for investigations of connections between critics of for-profit colleges and Wall Street short sellers. There was another person who seemed to tilt towards the for-profits. His name was Michael Dakduk. He was the head of Student Veterans for America. Then he took a new job, lobbyist for the for-profit colleges at APSCU. For-profit colleges have also co-opted the media. The leading chronicler of higher education is called the Chronicle of Higher Education. They allowed Career Education Corporation, another for-profit college, not only to sponsor an event on student debt and avoiding student debt, but to pick all the speakers for the event, despite the school's own terrible record on student loan defaults. One of my colleagues said this was like a conference about preventing lung cancer sponsored by the tobacco companies. The University of Phoenix sponsors NBC's Education Nation Conference. One person told me after she criticized University of Phoenix on CNBC, she was disinvited from speaking at the conference. Bridgepoint Education and Steve Forbes just signed a deal in San Diego, which Bridgepoint, which Senator Harkin called an absolute scam, would pay Forbes Media at least $45 million to call the business school there the Forbes School of Business. Of course, the for-profits also make ongoing campaign contributions to the likes of Speaker John Boehner and House Education Committee Chair Virginia Fox, who invoked the Holocaust in describing critics of for-profit colleges. A memo I obtained showed that the for-profit colleges were saying that their whole strategy for lobbying on Capitol Hill was directed by the House Republican leadership, and also that the group tied its lobbying directly to its campaign contributions. Many for-profit college executives are strongly tied to the Republican Party and heavily backed Mitt Romney in 2012. Romney was out praising for-profit colleges. It turned out the schools he praised were big donors to his campaign. In fact, Romney's own private equity firm was invested in these same colleges. But other for-profit colleges give heavily to both parties. Many members of Congress find that for-profit college owners are among their most loyal and active donors. One such man is named Arthur Benjamin, a self-styled philanthropist who can be seen in photographs on his website socializing with George Bush, Bill Clinton, Flo Rida, Ashton Kutcher, Brandy Roderick, all kinds of celebrities. It turned out that Benjamin was the CEO of ATI, a systematic fraud that was shut down by the Justice Department last year after taking $236 million of taxpayer money. Another of these friends of politicians was named Ernesto Perez, the CEO of Dade Medical College in Florida, which has been taking about $33 million a year from taxpayers. Perez gave at least $100,000 to political candidates. He put Florida politicians on his payroll. He explained to a reporter that he needed to buy access in order to do business because his business was dependent on taxpayer money. He was recently indicted for hiding a felony conviction when he was nominated by Florida's governor to a state board. That was the board overseeing for-profit colleges. Perhaps, though, the most effective lobbyist was Donald Graham, CEO of the Washington Post Company, which obtained 55% of its revenues from the Kaplan Education Division. Now, for the Washington establishment, Donald Graham was someone who attended the same social functions, someone they knew, someone they could trust. and he told them that he was helping low-income people and that they should stop bothering him. Almost 70% of Kaplan students drop out. Kaplan's now under investigation by a number of states. Kaplan and other for-profit colleges also lobbied states through their membership in the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, notorious for its support of voter ID and stand your ground laws. One more powerful lobbying force was the big banks who make money off student loans. Wells Fargo also owns a big chunk of Corinthian colleges, while Goldman Sachs owns 41% of EDMC. In the face of all this lobbying and all the campaign money, every House Republican and 50 Democrats voted in 2011 to block the rule Bob was discussing, the gainful employment rule. There's a word for this state of affairs, and that word is corruption. The congressional recipients support the interests of their donors. It's understood there doesn't need to be an explicit deal. Why else would small government Republicans oppose efforts to hold accountable companies that receive most of their revenue from federal billions? Why else would Democrats oppose protecting hardworking Americans from predatory corporations? After all this pressure, the Obama administration, as Bob said, issued a gainful employment rule with absurdly low standards. Still, the rule threatened to cut off federal aid to the worst programs. So the trade association hired expensive lawyers who got the rule overturned in court. The administration is trying again, and again, the for-profit colleges are pressuring members of Congress to pressure the administration to back off. The for-profit colleges have now enlisted the powerful U.S. Chamber of Commerce, whose CEO just pledged to do everything we can to block this rule. Fortunately, this gainful employment rule isn't the only game in town. Federal enforcement agencies like the FTC, the SEC, the CFPB, and the Justice Department have awoken to the threat. And in recent weeks, we've seen a remarkable surge in this as school after school in the for-profit college industry, the biggest schools, have received demands for information, subpoenas, and it looks like finally law enforcement is stepping up to do something about this. And hopefully, this kind of activity is less susceptible to political pressure than the issue of gainful employment and the regulation. But it's really President Obama who needs to step up. We need this rule. And as Bob quoted, the president clearly understands the nature of the problem. If he doesn't insist on these stronger rules, the lives of countless more students are going to be ruined. It's really long past time to stop this cycle of abuse and also this cycle of terrible, terrible political corruption. That's my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Constance Iloh is a University of Southern California researcher, PhD candidate at the Rossier School of Education and Gates Millennium Scholar. Prior to beginning her doctoral studies at USC, she earned a bachelor's at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a master's in business management at Wake Forest University. While currently serving as a research associate at the Pullias Center for Higher Education, her work addresses privatization, access equity, and the experiences of low-income students and students of color in higher education. Her dissertation explores the nature of Black student participation in for-profit higher education. Constance has already authored a half-dozen peer-reviewed journal articles and presented her research at multiple education conferences in the United States and abroad. In addition to her scholarship, her expertise has already caught the attention of Black Enterprise and the Campaign for College Opportunity, Gen Why Not, and the White House Initiative for Educational Excellence for African Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, Constance Iloh.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Ian. Good evening, everyone. So within the past decade, for-profit higher education has been the fastest growing sector of higher education, arguably also the most controversial and the least understood. And so while the model of traditional public higher education continues to dissolve, we're now challenged with understanding the access, experiences, and outcomes of the more than 2.4 million students enrolled in for-profit higher education today. So So in this presentation, I really want to focus on students in terms of how we can really make sense of the for-profit higher education enterprise. Not only do students inspire my own work, but I think in terms of making sense and understanding this larger conversation on the privatization of education, it really needs to center on students. So before I get into the nuts and bolts of this presentation, I really invite you all to tweet the session. I think we can all agree that this discussion needs to permeate multiple spaces. And I also feel in terms of higher education, the revolution won't be televised, but it probably will be tweeted. Oh, you guys like that? Cool. Cite me if you use that, please. But yeah, so when I thought about this daunting task of really trying to condense the for-profit sector into 10 minutes, hopefully I can go 11, really focusing on students, I thought the best way to do that would really be to center this on 4 questions. The first 3 being inspired by students, and the 4th being one that I really want to offer to you all in terms of how we can move this conversation forward. So I'll begin with that. So the first question is, what is a for-profit college? And so this question is deceptively simple because what often comes to mind is the institutions in the background of this image: the University of Phoenix, DeVry, ITT Tech. And that's true, these are for-profit colleges, but what I really want to problematize are 2 things. The first being that the for-profit sector is actually a very diverse sector of higher education. Not only does it have some of the largest institutions we have in higher education, it also has some of the smallest. These being small, mom-and-pop proprietary institutions, cosmetology and beauty schools, small trade schools, including even mid-size institutions that offer 1 or 2 trades for their specialty. So we're really actually talking about a very heterogeneous sector, and while these larger institutions do enroll over 60% of the for-profit sector, they actually only represent about 15% of the sector. So that's one thing I wanted to interrogate a little bit. And this second thing I kind of wanted to problematize with this question is the for-profit part of for-profit college. What does that actually mean? And so when I interview a lot of students, whether they attend a nonprofit or for-profit institution, they actually end up telling me, well, what college isn't a for-profit college? And while some may agree or disagree with that statement, I think they're kind of onto something in what they're saying. So as I've done extensive research on the for-profit sector, what really distinguishes them from the nonprofit sector is not just this for-profit motive, but really one of taxation, as these institutions actually have to pay taxes. And I think in terms of getting into the nuances and complexities of who is for-profit and who isn't, I think it would serve us much better if we begin to look at this less as a dichotomy of nonprofit and for-profit and more of a continuum, so we can look at strategic institutional practices and what this actually means in terms of who is profit maximizing, who isn't, what's going on. And I think in the 21st century higher education landscape, we're seeing a very strong blur of those values and goals. So the second question is, who are for-profit college students? Maybe an image already comes to mind. What I wanted to offer was this. So over 56% of for-profit students are older, that being over the age of 24. Most of their students are women, over 65%. A good number of students are actually students of color. 40% of their enrollment are students of color, and many of these students are considered low income and are from less educated backgrounds. So when we're talking about who the for-profit sector actually educates, we're really talking about the most marginalized students in higher education and those most likely to be underserved. And so one of the things I wanted to point out about this University of Phoenix image is just the variety of different students that we're seeing, whether they're veterans, mothers, obviously much older. And so we can problematize different gender and race and occupational narratives seen in this type of advertising. But one thing I wanted to offer too is that in the same way that this is the politics of representation, we're also seeing politics of exclusion in other sectors of higher education, as arguably a USC or a UCLA would not have any type of image like this on any type of brochure. So who should be serving these students? And as we distill this even further, we get a more clear image of who are the students most likely to attend for-profit higher education. These being women who are usually age 27, have 1 or 2 children, are either Latino or African American, and are looking to fulfill or have some type of career change. And as I was, going through this presentation, I just thought how strange it was that these 2 images look strikingly similar, and a similar type of narrative is being told in this. And again, too, we can problematize different race and gender narratives just in these images alone. So I just wanted to highlight further the number of low-income students that take up the for-profit sector. Of the students that are considered dependent, over 54% come from families that make under $40,000 a year. And what is really important about highlighting the fact that these students are already coming in low income is the amount of debt that they take on, which is something that Bob had kind of hit on. So 96% of for-profit students take out student loans. This is compared with 13% in the community college sector, 48% in private institutions, and 57% in private and 48% in public institutions. So obviously within the for-profit sector, most of their students are taking out loans. And of those that graduate with bachelor's, 57% when they're done have debt that's higher than $30,000. And so I had discussed earlier how students of color make up 40% of these for-profit enrollments, but of particular importance is the number of Black students enrolling. As of 2011, the institution that actually gave out the most bachelor's degrees to Black students was the University of Phoenix. So although 1 in 20 students enroll in a for-profit college, this figure is actually 1 in 10 for Black students. And just in this very state of California, more students that are Black are actually enrolled in for-profit colleges in the UC system and the CSU system combined. And that actually came out from a recent project from the Campaign for College Opportunity. So when I approached this presentation, I said to myself, Connie, don't talk about your dissertation, just, stay on task. But since you all are here, for my dissertation, I actually will be examining, as Ian had mentioned, Black student participation in the for-profit sector. And what I'm really excited about is just getting into different notions of Black buying power and purchase power in higher education, also the importance of marketing appeals and different cultural and environmental factors that really are influencing this mass participation in the for-profit sector, particularly in the state of California. So speaking of California, we really don't need to look far in terms of thinking about, who are these for-profit college students? Because this state enrolls the most, and especially in large urban areas such as Los Angeles. So the third question that is inspired by students actually came from an interview I did with the student who had just blatantly said, if not a for-profit college, where? And so I was interviewing a student. She's in her early 30s. She has 2 kids. She's African American, and she was currently enrolled in a nursing program at a for-profit college. And what she had said was that, a lot of people think I'm stupid for enrolling in this institution. But what they don't know is that I started at a community college. I was trying to finish up the requirements. I couldn't finish. I tried to transfer to a CSU. I couldn't get in there, and it was just a no when I tried to go to a UC. And I think the problem that we often have is that we think of students choosing higher education as this grocery store experience where if you want the low-cost option, maybe you can reach down and get that on the shelf, or if you want the brand-recognized institution, the Ivy League, if it fits, you can get that. But really what she described, and for a lot of underserved students, that's really not the case. It actually looks more like this, where it really is this maze where students may end up at a college. It may not be the one that they originally wanted to go to, but there's a number of different barriers that she highlighted. This could be capacity issues. California has a lot of that, barriers in terms of finishing different requirements. One thing I also want to highlight is just problems with information. So if students have enough information to make the appropriate decision, are there any problems with financial literacy? and things of that nature. And I think this particular image is most indicative of experiences of students that are most underserved in higher education already. So the fourth question, and the one that I really want to offer to you all, is this last one. What do we think students are really buying when they purchase higher education? And I think it's a timely one that will really move this discussion forward, because I think there's a number of different things going on. A student very well may be buying the brand equity of an institution when they decide to enroll. They could just be really trying to get a credential. Some students may enroll to get a certain set of experiences. Higher education isn't a cheeseburger that you can just kind of eat and throw away. It's an experience good. It's a student in an environment, and they have certain outcomes. So what are students really expecting when they end up here? What do they actually get, and what are the issues and problems with that? So I really want to thank you all for listening. I look forward to the discussion. And if you are curious in any way, also feel free to see my publications. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance. So let me start with Bob, because I'd like to get a perspective on you mentioned, I think, 33 billion, or maybe David did, is of taxpayer money spent on for-profit colleges. If you add that to the student loan industry, which is, again, recycling government money, what kind of figure do you come up with in the overall budget of the Department of Education? In other words, how much of our taxpayers' money is going in this direction as opposed to in a more...
So about 25% of student aid, which is grants and loans from the U.S. Department of Education, is going to for-profit colleges and universities. So about a quarter when they're enrolling about 13% of the students.
And in terms of the overall loan portfolio, how much of because they're making money out of
it's probably
students.
about that. I don't know. I don't know what the precise figure is, but it is of the trillion plus in outstanding student loans. It's probably in the area of a quarter that would be the for-profit colleges.
So when I was saying in the beginning, so many politicians have used this mantra, we've got to do something about education. I mean, what money's left? In other words, you would think that the focus would be on spending these resources in ways that match the rhetoric that we really are trying to.
That's absolutely what we need. I mean, we need for-profit colleges to be great. We need the description that I had gotten from those for-profit executives to actually be true, because then we would have better outcomes. We would have students who, some of the, there are a few large for-profit colleges. I'm thinking one in particular, American Public University, that charges less. People have less debt, and they seem to have better incomes. We know, or better outcomes. So we know it's possible, and we know that there are ways that government policy can help push those colleges in that direction, so that those good incentives that they have to be efficient and to match workforce needs are what actually drives the day-to-day activity of the colleges, rather than what we have seen, which is the race to the bottom.
Let me ask you, David, since you work in Washington, is this a part of the broader problem of this privatization movement that started under President Reagan, where so many of the government services have been privatized in the military, we know from Halperin, et cetera, but we've just seen with the launch of the Obamacare website, that was a private contractor. I think one of the first times I got a hint of it was a Walter Reed scandal, where they fired all the government people and they brought in these people that literally had no experience, no background. It was simply an overnight corporation that hung up a shingle and hired low-income workers. I mean, in the work that you used to do on the Senate Intelligence Committee, we now learn that the company that does all the background checks on people like Edward Snowden was hiring the lowest possible wage workers to do this work. So is that inherently a part of the problem, where you have set up a mechanism where the the company, its real incentive is to cut costs. And I cannot understand how in the education business, the main cost would be the value of the teacher, which is supposed to be really important. So in this world, are we getting the cheapest teachers you can find?
One of the things that I learned about Mitt Romney, I'll come back to, is that he figured out a lot of great businesses to be in are businesses where a lot of the money or most of the money comes from government. It's automatic money. It's easy money. It's not questioned. I certainly also see a lot of corruption and failure and weakness when the government tries to do things itself. So it's really, which system is the worst? Well, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with privatizing certain functions of government if you create the incentives to give companies incentives to do the things that you want them to do. In for-profit education, Bob was suggesting, it is not really a free market program. It's a government program. It's funded almost entirely by the government. The question is, do you create rules where people have incentives to ruin students' lives, or do you create rules where people actually have incentives and make the most money by helping students? So where there's privatization, that's fine, but it can't be something where the privatization is just an excuse to take money and do nothing with it. And the biggest problem, as I was trying to suggest, is that once you give an industry a huge amount of taxpayer money, then they want to keep getting that money. And they have a lot of money to keep lobbying, and they get good at being in Washington and figure out how they can keep going and avoid scrutiny. So again, we create monsters in the defense industry, in the education industry, in the healthcare industry, and then we cannot stop them. It's hard inherently to figure out how to do privatization and also work in and keep accountability.
And Constance, in terms of minority students, clearly from what these two gentlemen told us is that they're not necessarily being well served. So how do you navigate between the needs of minority students and apparently the extent to which this venue, that's maybe the only one open to a lot of people, is so fraught with fraud, I guess is the only way to put it?
I think it's an important question. One of the things I really tried to think about in terms of my own research is, where the problem is, like where it starts, where it permeates. And I think it's not a sector-specific problem. I think one of the things I've seen as I've interviewed different students, particularly those that are enrolled in for-profit colleges and community colleges, is that there's a number of different barriers, whether it's community colleges like not having the resources or being understaffed and not being able to serve the students in the way they want to, and students then going to a for-profit college, or students having somewhat good experiences at for-profit colleges, but maybe the labor outcomes are not what they expected them to be. So I think this is really not a superhero villain story. I think it really is up to us to say, well, what are the problems in each sector and how do we begin to understand them from students of color perspective, low-income students? Because I think in a lot of ways, various different sectors have let these students down. But I think what ends up happening is that, we want to look for a scapegoat for these problems. And I think really it's time for accountability for all institutions to really say, are we doing the best that we can for all these student groups? And I would say that many institutions would not get a passing grade if that was the question.
Well, that raises the real question about not the other part of the education spectrum, which is the Harvards. How do you navigate between the idea that you have students out there getting, fine arts degrees and stuff, and God knows where they're going to get employed on the one hand, and on the other hand,
don't you hire fine arts people?
Well, isn't it? What's his name? Garrison Keillor keeps making fun of English majors, as though they're terminally unemployable. But on the other hand, do we want to have an educational system that's basically an incubator for corporate America?
Well, I think some of the things that employers and people want in leaders are what you learn at a liberal arts college, and it's the exploration that occurs, knowing that a question should be asked and not just following directions are the kinds of things that you cannot. It's not like teaching somebody a computer program. It's getting them involved in experiences, and unpredictable things happen, and they respond to them, they don't respond to them, and that is what produces the kind of deeper learning that comes from that. Whether you are whatever you are majoring in, that's the kind of experience at a college that produces the people who, in a job, are maybe doing some routine things, but the education they had arms them to ask a question when something doesn't quite seem right. It arms them when they are laid off from that job to be able to adapt what they had been doing to something else. And so we do not want to turn our colleges and universities into essentially training people to do one thing. It really has to be training them to be thinkers. And that's thinkers not just for a job, but as citizens, so that when there is a discussion about a public policy issue, they can analyze it and they can figure out what their position is, and they can write their letter to the governor. So I think that's what we need in education, and I think one of the issues, and this is where I guess I maybe take issue a little bit with, sort of all colleges are alike at their core. What education is, I mean, there's Constance's slide about what are people buying. What education is and what a good education is, it's true that it's hard to define. And you want the people who are making the decision about what is good enough to be making that decision not based on their own pocketbook. And at for-profit colleges, everyone is conflicted by pocketbook issues, by what answer will benefit my wallet, my bank account. At nonprofits and public institutions, the boards ultimately do not have a financial interest. The people who ultimately are deciding what goes on at that college, how much people are paid, they don't have an ownership interest in the college. They might not make all the decisions we want them to make, and I agree that there are problems at a lot of public institutions and nonprofit institutions, and maybe they're making decisions based on the football team and various other kinds of things, but we know they are not making the decision based on their bank account, and that's why there are worse problems, not the only problems, but worse problems at for-profit colleges.
And David, we haven't talked about the billionaires, the Iloh Browds, the Waltons, the Gates. So, what is driving that the interdiction, if you will, of very, very successful and wealthy people? I mean, obviously a lot of people consider them sort of meddling moguls.
Well, I think that those folks are concerned, and I give them due, and that they put their money and thought into this, but how we do give people opportunity and train them and keep the economy going. And sometimes people like Bill Gates have whether he's been co-opted or whether he really thinks so, has been sympathetic to things like for-profit colleges. What those schools are speaking to is something that I do think we need more of. A lot of people don't have the luxury of really being able to say, I need 4 years, or I can do 4 years of liberal arts, however valuable that is. They have 2 kids. They just got out of the service. They are poor. They're taking care of an elderly parent. They need a job. And these for-profit college ads and recruiters speak to them because they say, we're going to put you on the fast track to something to turn your life around. The problem is there isn't a whole lot of competition of potentially more effective and honest institutions doing that. where are our community colleges? They're underfunded. Where are more apprentice programs? Where are high schools that could be focused more on training people for careers? We're not investing in those things. So the for-profit colleges swoop in and provide what looks like something that is really good. In fact, it's too good to be true. But if I would like to see those philanthropists, and I would like to see other people say, let's put the pressure on government to take money away from those for-profit colleges that are disserving students, take some of that $33 billion and give it to community colleges, give it to high schools, and use it to actually have effective institutions and honest institutions that do this important thing of training people for careers in web design and being an electrician and being a nurse and being a nurse's assistant. The people are needed for the jobs, and there ought to be faster and better ways to connect them to those careers.
And Constance, there is I think a difference here in the United States. There's always been an emphasis on the Ivy League, and people have come from all around the world to be educated in the United States, because at the very top we do have the best schools, but we have not focused on trade colleges like they do in Europe, on apprenticeships and electricians and plumbers and beauticians and all of these, and nurses, etc. Would you agree that maybe some of this money that's going to these for-profits could be redirected to community colleges?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think it trickles back to what our priorities are. One of the biggest thing I'm seeing in terms of the community colleges is, again, they're stressed with trying to do many different things, whether it's remediating students, whether it's actually getting them to be able to transfer to another institution, whether it's actually preparing them vocationally. So again, as we think about, what we want to do with the money that we would give to community colleges, I think we also need to be clear about the numerous different things that they're already trying to do for students and are also under-resourced in doing. So I think when there's a level of specificity, I'm not sure about what would happen in terms of reallocating money, but I could certainly say that particular sector would benefit a lot from more money, especially since they do 50% of their enrollments are already students of color. They educate the most students of color in higher ed, the most low-income students. So they certainly could benefit from more, but I think we need to be specific about how we're going to use community colleges, because they're already trying to do so much. And I think they've taken up a lot of the slack that a lot of institutions don't feel like they actually need to do anymore.
Well, let's get questions here from the audience. We have microphones on both sides, I take it. I don't know where are our Oprahs with the microphones.
They're coming. Can I add
Yes,
a little bit?
go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on the community colleges. California has 112 community colleges. Only one of them has a technical focused theme. Most of them have some technical programs, but you walk in the door and you end up facing the maze that Constance talked about. It's like, which for some people that's fine. They want to just kind of wander in the maze of courses that you can take. But for a lot of the target students that we're talking about, whether they're at a community college or going to a for-profit college, they are looking to get some training, and I think it would help California a lot if some number of our community colleges became more technical focused, like LA Trade Tech and other states that have more of those kinds of community colleges have much higher completion rates at their colleges than our community colleges. We also spend a lot less here per student at our community colleges than other places in the country. Students need advising, support, help with that maze, so we definitely could use some of that money that's going to the for-profit colleges to help our community colleges.
Hi, I wondered if you could speak to this. When I entered the workforce, you learned skills on the job. You had an education that was more broad, but once you entered the workplace, they made an investment in you, and because they had an investment in you, they were more likely to hold on to you for a period of time to get a return on that investment. I'm seeing workers who are skilled being employed increasingly temporarily, and I'm wondering if externalizing this cost of training onto the students and workers themselves is increasing our unemployability or making it harder for us to stay employed because there's less of an investment on the part of the employers. Thanks.
Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to try. When at the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a economic panel created, and as a staff member at the Department of Education, I participated in interviewing employers, and we were asking them about do you want people who have certain skills, or do you train people? We were about half of them said one and half said the other. So we didn't get it. So there were some employers that said, don't try to train them in what we do. We want people who are smart thinkers, critical thinkers, come in, we'll help them out, we'll train them what to do, and others didn't. But there's definitely is a problem where employers that less and less are putting their own money into training their workers because, and the question of the cause and effect, I don't know, but they're afraid of investing in a worker who will then leave them and go someplace else. So they put the money into training them, and then they go off somewhere else. So then they start wanting to just hire people who already have the skills so that they don't have to do the training. So it seems to be shifting in that direction, perhaps for that reason.
Mm-hmm. And I think your question also raises the point of how many jobs actually need particular types of degrees. I know that in California, I hear all the time, we need 1 million more college-educated people to do X, Y, and Z. Very rarely is there ever a discussion of, what particular industries need a certain amount of college-educated workers. So I think also, too, like when we begin to care about the specificity needed about, what job actually needs a master's degree? What would that actually benefit? What does that do? We can really drill down on some of these things because in reality, some students could actually be paying for a level of education that actually is not necessary for the job that they're going for. And I think that mismatch, and as we continue to push this, get this degree, or the bachelor's is the new whatever, the master's is a new bachelor's degree. I think we really lose sight of the fact that, again, students are paying a lot of money for these degrees, and we need to be certain that there's a match in terms of what the job that they're going for actually needs.
The gentleman here.
Thank you. Parenthetically, I actually was in a retraining program at LA Trade Tech about 20 years ago as I came out of aerospace layoff. Question is, how do you induce better outcomes, right? How do you induce better outcomes from the university? So if they're coming in with good intentions or whatever their intentions may be, that the outcomes are appropriate to the people having the training and the education. Is the accreditation process of these colleges, does it have any role to play within creating better outcomes? And if it does, is it also rife to be co-opted, just as you were talking about? Thank you.
You want me to start? Go ahead.
You know more about it than I do.
Well, I'll start, and others can weigh in. Accreditation for people, people who've heard the word accreditation, they don't necessarily know what that means. But basically, there are these private associations of colleges that that are supposed to kind of serve as a improvement ground and making sure that all the colleges who are a member of this club, in fact, are keeping their standards up high enough. So the college will come in every Sometimes it's up to 10 years, might be every 5 years, every 10 years. We'll do a self-study. They'll look at how are we doing as a college, and they'll basically present to other people from the association who can say, you're not up to snuff, you have some things to work on, or can say, okay, you get to be accredited again for another number of years. Government wanting to be cautious about making judgments about what is a college education. You can imagine why this could be a problem for government. Would we have wanted George Bush's appointees deciding, which colleges are worthy or which programs are worthy at a college? I can just imagine, trying to deal with questions of evolutionary biology and having government making decisions about this. So you want to have having that, there's some separation there makes some sense, but obviously there's some co-opting that goes on there, and it is very difficult for these associations that we're as government kind of relying on them as being the experts in deciding what a good education is. Once you are accredited, you really have to mess up big time to lose your accreditation. The association that you then become a part of is they're not going to kick you out of your eligibility for all financial aid. So it's a really, really tough problem to figure out how accreditation is supposed to handle this. Now, on this for-profit college issue, where they are supposed to be focused on career programs, it's a little bit easier because a career program has a clearer, specific endpoint in terms of getting a job. And so that's why the gainful employment regulation can help out, which is career programs at any kinds of colleges, but it's the for-profits that opposed it. But it's true, the accreditation, there's been pressure on accreditors to get better at what they do and to define and to get colleges to define outcomes and push toward those outcomes. But it has been inadequate, and it has been especially inadequate when you have a massive publicly traded company with hundreds of lawyers hammering away at an accrediting agency that's like 12 people who worked at colleges, and they're just completely outgunned. There is no way that they're going to be able to police that huge publicly traded company.
And there's a new wrinkle in this, which is now some for-profit colleges are suing accreditors, saying you should have accredited us and we're wronged. And I've been getting these emails from firm Lanny Davis's law firm saying, gee, don't you want to see what Lanny's doing? He's taking a tough stand on the accreditors. I'm saying, are you sure you know who you're talking to? Because Lanny Davis threatened to sue me and has been attacking all the critics of for-profit colleges. Are you sure you want me to be working as helping Lanny Davis publicize his work? But so the accreditors are either co-opted, or they're overwhelmed, or now they're being sued, and so they're afraid. So accrediting is a useful, I think, potentially useful exercise, but it's no substitute for also having the government say what this gainful employment rule says, which is simply, if the majority of your students can't pay down their loans, maybe that's not a program that we should continue to fund. And if you want to continue to get federal money, help your students succeed.
What a concept. The gentleman here in the middle, just wait for a second. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, for those students who actually go to for-profit college and they get a degree, what credibility does society or business give that degree?
In a lot of times, students find out afterwards, not much. Now, there are some fine for-profit colleges, and especially smaller ones, ones that have been around and didn't get co-opted by Wall Street money and have figured out ways to succeed, and they may in their own community have a good reputation. Quite often, though, with the big for-profit colleges, students will come out and find out, I mean, sorry to say it, but that the degrees are considered by many employers to be just a joke.
Yeah, sometimes what ends up happening is that within the for-profit colleges, they specify they have relationships with different employers. Whether that's actually true or not, sometimes those things fall through, but sometimes they speak to students about relationships they have. I think there's a difference, too, between what are the outcomes students want when they graduate. I know that I've talked to professors who have said, well, I would never look at the transcript of a student that came from a for-profit college, whereas, some employers, depending on the actual job, might or may not. But again, the brand equity of most for-profit colleges is not that of most other institutions of higher education. But again, when a lot of students are thinking about and trying to enroll in these institutions, either, they're very much attracted to the fact that the institution wants to enroll them, or they actually see an opportunity to actually pursue higher education. So I think that really speaks to information issues that need to happen on the front end, and just maybe even different types of information asymmetry where students don't know that on the other side of things, the brand equity isn't that of what might lend itself better to the job that they actually want. So I think it's not even just a credibility issue, but really an understanding of the brand of these institutions, which really may not be all that well known by a lot of employers and the rest of higher education in general.
The gentleman here in the orange shirt.
You mentioned default, but you can't really go bankrupt. You claim bankruptcy if you have a student loan that's gone into default. Can you guys talk about what happens to those guys? Because basically, it's like you said, they're worse than mafia as far as collecting goes, and there's not really much you can do as far as collecting that money if there's no money to get, right? And then what is that? What kind of society does that create? And can Obama pardon all of this?
Want me to start again? All right. Well, so one good development that's occurred over the past several years is something called income-based repayments on federal student loans. So it basically says if your income is low, you obviously didn't get what you were supposed to, what you needed to out of college. So at least for now, you don't have to make any payments. And after an extended period of time, it can end up being forgiven at the end of that period. It's not an immediate wonderful gift or anything like that, but at least I think one of the worst things about what we have done to people with student loans is that not only do we ruin their credit and make them feel like not only did their college experience not pay off, but they're being punished for having tried. But other people see that, other people in their neighborhood, and then those people don't pursue higher education because they see how it undermined how it made it difficult for this person to be even go back to a college and get a Pell Grant if you are in default on a student loan. There are a lot of problems right now just in terms of information and helping people to take advantage of the programs that we created. What happens to people if you don't make payments on your student loans? If there's a tax refund, your tax refund gets taken before it ever gets to you. When you retire or receive disability, you end up having some of that taken. So especially if it's a government student loan, they have ways of finding any money you have and getting you to pay.
I talk to a veteran quite often, talk to him almost every day, in fact, who owes $100,000, went to 2 for-profit colleges and got nothing out of it and really needs to start over. He says, I dream of bankruptcy. And what did they do also besides his tax refund? He went back and worked at Office Depot. They garnished his wages. He said they don't think of things that people might need day to day, like food.
And you can't declare bankruptcy. That was
Because that's another thing, the power of the banks who make student loans or are connected to the student loan companies. They don't want you to be able to declare bankruptcy because they want to keep coming after you for the money.
Yeah. This lady here in front may have to be the last question here.
Thank you. I find everything spoken tonight, with the exception of Constance, was demonizing the for-profit colleges. And I find it inappropriate that you would blame the college for the not successful outcome of a student. It's the student who may not have the possibility or the conditions in the economy that don't allow for a job that's appropriate with the money spent. So why aren't we changing our view and our emphasis on perhaps the college that can provide something? When you go to, you've never mentioned any of the major state schools or the UC system that also charges quite a bit, and the students often have to go 5 or 6 years because the classrooms are so huge, they don't have enough professors to provide small enough classes so they can take it. I think all of these things need to be taken into consideration and not completely demonize the smaller schools that are perhaps for-profit.
There are, as I said, there are very fine for-profit colleges, and I think all of us agree with that. The problem is, particularly the big ones, the difference between them and, say, a UC school is they admit students whom they know can't do the work, whom they know will fail. And the majority of students drop out of for-profit colleges their first year, and they know that's going to happen. They make private loans to these students knowing they're not going to be able to repay them because it improves their compliance with federal law by allowing students to help finance their own education. So it is the cynicism of some of these schools. I don't love nonprofit colleges at all, and I think they could improve a lot. But the problem is we've really seen now, and now it is a matter of concern definitely for law enforcement, that some of these schools are really running a systematic fraud designed simply to make money and not to help students. And believe me, if you could talk with these students and you could hear about what happened to them, I'm not sure that you would be so ready to say that it was their fault that they ended up the way they did, because the school knew exactly what they're doing. In fact, the algorithm that is used, I'm told by insiders who do the work of trying to find students online and connect them with for-profit colleges, here's what they maximize. They look for people who are single mothers of color with children under 6 years old, because they think those are the people that they will most likely be able to convince to come in, and least likely really be able to help get jobs. If the programs were designed to help students, we would love what they were doing, but they're often designed simply to take their money, and they end up much worse off.
Well, I thank all of you.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Do you want to have a quick last word? Because we're wrapping up here.
No, I mean, I guess I just wanted to reiterate again, like, this is a higher education problem. And I think even as we begin to understand higher education as a business overall, and, maybe not this traditional sector is the purveyor of the public good, and we really begin to tease away and think about these complexities, we'll really arrive at some serious answers that keep students in mind. So, I mean, I think the point is an interesting one and something that we just need to consider moving forward.
Well, I thank everybody here for joining us here, and David from coming all the way from the East Coast, and Bob, thank you.